All right. So our presentation was on deaf education at the college level. A little overview. Um, the three main all-deaf colleges in the US include Gallaudet University, which we've talked a lot about in the class, which is located in Washington, D.C., the National Technical Institution for the Deaf, or NTID, in Rochester, New York, and Southwest Collegiate Institute for the Deaf in Big Spring, Texas. There's two photos of the colleges out east. I thought it was interesting reading over this that there are deaf schools, not colleges, all over the globe in places such as the Philippines and South Africa and Italy. And it's cool that deaf students learn all over. But the three colleges in the US are the major deaf colleges.
So for pros and cons with deaf education, it can be a little difficult to find what people see as pros and cons, but a lot of the pros, there's no language barrier, so your students are able to communicate with one another easily. You don't have to worry about a translator, so you're not getting information delayed. It's really easy to relate with the other students around you, so there's a stronger community. For a lot of these students, they have important adult role models now. They've got professors who, many of them are fluent in ASL and they speak it very well. So it kind of gives them hope that they can succeed in the world as well. And it's a very focused approach. So you've got a lot of people who are deaf then doing the teaching. They know what approaches they need to take to help a student succeed. But there are some cons that go along with this. Like for many deaf colleges, there's kind of a lack of exposure to the hearing world. So you miss out on a little bit of the elements that come with that co-education. And the academics do suffer a little bit because a lot of the education is trying to help these deaf students succeed in the hearing world. And you can actually even read about that in Deaf Again by Mark, when he's talking about how a lot of the programs is super easy to get through. A lot of the earlier classes, just because they had to lower expectations, since you've got a lot of students coming in from all sorts of different backgrounds who have different levels of education, and some have never attended an actual deaf program before. So those are some of the cons that go along with the good.
So now we'll kind of go into the options that are available for these deaf students at deaf universities. And so what may surprise a lot of people is that the majors don't really differ much than big universities that people of the hearing world will go to. So options with like art, digital media, business, communication, and government are all viable options for these people. And not only that, but there are a lot of other paths that people who are deaf can go down. And continuing that, a deaf classroom, though some people might have a picture in their heads that it would look completely different than their own classroom, but in a short answer, it's not that much different than what we experience at our universities. The one difference that I kind of noticed as looking at a lot of different pictures at Gallaudet and other universities is the shape of the classroom seems to be very oriented around the professor, so that the students can easily hear, or not hear, but see the professor signing the information to them, so that they don't miss out on any important pieces of information. And not only that, but accommodations are made for students who may not be fluent in ASL, just like how Mark wasn't completely into the fluent ASL world. They do provide resources for kids just like that. Then now looking at deaf universities within a COVID world, obviously COVID has changed a lot of people's lives, and to say deaf people are very much also affected by it, as 74% of deaf students have said being online 100% is a lot harder than previously using the professor's resources when they were in person. And not only that, but they also have limited access to interpreters. So where they would be able to get information better and more accessible to them, now they're all online. So a lot of this information that was really, or resources that were really needed for them to help for them to succeed is kind of stripped away. So it's really challenging for a lot of students to operate within this online format. And also Apple has helped try to alleviate some of the stress for deaf students and professors as well, as they've donated a bunch of devices to help this learning process go as smoothly as possible. So they have devices such as like the new iPads that will use as a feature they call Sidecar. So it'll go along with their MacBook so they can effortlessly have slides and be able to sign at the same time, just overall making it an easier experience for the professors. And also new AirPods have like a hearing aid connectivity, which can help a lot of the students who maybe aren't 100% deaf and still have a little bit of hearing. And not only that, but Apple has also helped contribute a new scholarship program to help a lot of these struggling students. And then to continue with this, the isolation problem seems to be really especially huge for deaf students. For example, we've seen through Deaf Again that Mark has experienced much or a lot of these isolation problems that people in the deaf community experience. So COVID only amplifies this. So a lot of these deaf people have a hard time connecting with a lot of their peers and people within their community. And this is there's just a big need for expanded tutoring services and student connection opportunities so that these students can connect with one another and live a happier lifestyle than just being at home on their computer all day.
So I kind of looked at what languages were used at this college level, and since there are some fully deaf colleges, most of those students are fluent in ASL, so there is ASL-led learning. But like we saw with Mark, there might be people just like Mark and they may not be fully fluent in ASL, so there are accommodations that are made for that. But if a deaf student is having to go more of the traditional college route because of the lack of like fully deaf colleges around the United States, these traditional colleges do use a lot of adaptive technology to communicate with these students and for the students to communicate with other people at the university as well. So this video clip is from Gallaudet. It's their football team, and it just kind of shows how they communicate on the football team as deaf students.
Wide receiver L.J. Watson speaks and signs, a technique called SimCom. At first, he and his hard of hearing teammates, Daquan Taylor and Rashard Witherspoon, had a tough time seeing eye to eye.
I'm not gonna lie, team chemistry was hard.
The chemistry?
It's like hard to communicate with each other because some players on the team don't know sign.
Half of the players are deaf. Others are hard of hearing. And to have enough players to compete, each year, Coach Goldstein integrates into the team a few mainstream hearing athletes.
Our recruiting pool is limited. It's limited. So it's kind of a struggle. We have people who are looking online every day for a deaf, hard of hearing athlete. Go ahead and Google, try. Lock in.
All right, moving on. So success at the college level, it's important to remember that the best options for a student doesn't necessarily have to be higher level education. But if that is the best fit for the student, then the transition process must consider realistic goals. It's important to take into consideration the student's interests, ability levels, preferences, and individual needs to become a part of the adult world and the working world. An interesting fact that I found was around 20,000 deaf or hard of hearing students attend post-secondary educational institutions each year, which is a good amount of students, I think, and it's rising. Deaf students generally come to college underprepared compared to their hearing peers due to the lack of communication access, reduced social opportunities, or unqualified professionals in their high school, middle school, and elementary school academic careers or experiences. And we can see this as an example in Mark's case, as it was sort of a culture shock for him to be at a school where his professors were native ASL speakers and he could stay up till 3 a.m. having deep conversations with his friends. And then the video that I chose was from the Netflix documentary called Deaf U, and it was a little clip describing the cliques and statuses that come along with being deaf and going to a deaf university. You'll see in the video here students that are 4th or 5th generation, that come from 4th or 5th generation deaf families are considered elite. And it creates kind of this hierarchy of if someone is, quote, deaf enough. And so, yeah, we'll take a look.
Who's that looking at me? Who's that looking at me?
Okay, so kind of like Lexi was saying, a lot of people do end up being very successful in college at the college level, but through my research, there was really a push to ask these questions when you are considering either traditional or deaf schools, but especially when you're considering traditional colleges. So the biggest thing is what services are going to be readily available to you. So I know a lot of places have accommodation services or disability services, but most of the time they will not seek you out, so you have to seek them out. The biggest one that I found interesting was the housing accommodation. So if a deaf student is going to be living on campus, what is the university willing to offer them to make sure that they were safe and they're enjoying their experience? This might include like different fire alarms, having a roommate, not having a roommate, or even just different ways of communicating with members on their floor or in their dorm. And a big thing that I found interesting was the need for documentation to get these services. So they have a lot of services available for students that need them, but the amount of documentation sometimes that is needed from doctors or anybody like that is sometimes extensive. So really making sure that these students get the documentation that they need so they are like ready on day one to learn at their best ability. And then kind of continuing into the services that are available. So in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and this basically just said that everybody needs to have the equal right and ability to work and learn. So organizations and schools and workplaces are required to provide these accommodations for people with disabilities to perform at their best. So I know at Bethel we have like just one main disability services office, but sometimes at larger universities they have what's called assistive technology centers. And this would be somewhere that these students could go that help is readily available to them. Say they need help with their note-taking devices, they need help with their test taking, their online lectures, or really anything like that. They have these services available to them. And finally, the classroom assistance is huge. Like we saw with Mark, when he finally received an interpreter, he was able to like actively engage and learn in the classroom. And that is just a huge thing that students should seek out right away so they can be actively engaged.
And then to conclude, some local school options there. Well, based on my research, there is no colleges specifically for deaf students in Minnesota. The big three colleges in the United States are the ones that I mentioned in the beginning of the video in Washington, D.C., New York, and Texas. There are various public universities that offer deaf education degrees for hearing students. And like Sarah was talking about, hearing universities and public universities provide accommodations for deaf students, but there is no one all-inclusive college specifically in Minnesota for deaf students. In Minnesota, though, there are multiple deaf schools offered at the elementary, middle, and high school level. Two listed below are the Metro Deaf School in St. Paul, and then the Minnesota State Academy for the Deaf in Faribault. But yeah, so that concludes our PowerPoint. We have our references listed below here. Otherwise, thanks for listening.